guys, welcome to another Tim's Takeaway, and this will be Tim's Takeaway for the ENT, and this is going to be related to the circulatory system. Here in this section we're going to talk about the circulatory system as it relates to the cardiovascular system, and then we'll also take a look at not only the anatomy, we're also going to take a look at some of the physiology as it relates to the cardiovascular system. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So our first thing we want to take a look at is going to be related to the fact that inside of your circulatory system, we need to remember that we are breaking things down into two circuits. We're going to be dealing with the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Now, I know in my class, when we talk about some of this stuff, we bring up the fact that there are two circuits, and that pulmonary circuit is actually going to be dealing with oxygen. Poor blood is going to go from that right ventricle, which is going to be right in here, and that is going to then push blood into the lungs. So you can think of this is where that that pulmonary circuit is going, because remember that coming from blood and pulmonary, the word pulmonary is going to be related to basically the lungs. So we're going to talk about that part of dealing with a pulmonary circuit. And that is going to be essentially, as you can see here, we're dealing with blood that is coming from that right ventricle, and it is going to come out through the pulmonary. What is that going to be? Is that going to be a vein, or is it going to be an artery? Okay, well, you know, if you go off of I know that's not the greatest writing in the world, but if you go off of the old adage that, how does blood carry, which one carries oxygen and which one carries deoxygenated blood, that's going to mess you up in this process. So remember that veins carry blood to the heart, and arteries carry blood away from the heart. Okay, so veins are carrying the blood to the heart, and arteries are carrying blood away from the heart. So if you think of it in that manner, and we'll probably see that a little bit later on, hopefully it's going to make a little bit more sense to you. So that pulmonary circuit is then going to allow that blood to come from the pulmonary artery, and it is going to then be oxygenated through the lungs. And remember that we learned in the respiratory system that actual gas exchange is going to occur at the alveolar level. After it has been oxygenated, we do that through a process known as diffusion, which we saw earlier as well. It is then going to return blood to the heart, and it is going to do this through, remember, the pulmonary vein, because now we are returning blood to the heart. This is where it comes into that left atrium. And when it does so, it is then going to be forced out through, now we've reached into the systemic circulation, which is now going to be that part that is actually carrying the oxygen-rich blood from that left ventricle, and it's sending it back through the rest of the body. So here you can see that we're actually perfusing this through the rest of the body. So if you can think of that systemic circulation of everything that is coming from the left ventricle out, and then everything that we're talking about for the pulmonary system is going to be from the right ventricle going out. Okay, so hopefully that gives you just a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about when we break those two things down. Okay, so this takes us now to, let's take a look at the heart, and we're going to talk about the fact that this is dealing with basically the heart being a muscular organ. Okay, so this area here is going to be everything that you see here is going to be the myocardium. So if we start to take a look around, we can see that if we start back off, okay, that here is going to be okay. So now we're going to take a look at the heart, and I think when we talked about the heart just a little bit ago, and we're going to stop that again. So we talked about the heart just a little bit in relationship to the way that we're dealing with a pulmonary and systemic circulation. Yeah, I almost went blank there. And so let's take a better look at what the heart realized, that this is the myocardium. So when we're dealing with that myocardium, that's part of what we're actually talking about. We're talking about what is that myocardium. So you can see that there's a whole lot of other vessels that are here. So let's kind of break some things down here for us. And let's get some drawings here so we can see what's going on. This area here is going to be the right atrium. Okay, so that right atrium is going to take blood in, and here is the superior vena cava, and this portion down here is bringing blood up from basically anything that's below that heart, and is now going to be referred to as the inferior vena cava. And those are both veins. So it's all basically one big vein, but this is how the blood is now returning to the heart. This then means that this becomes the right ventricle. Okay, so with that right ventricle, we then have the blood that comes through, and after that blood comes through, it is then going to exit, and when we exit out of that right ventricle, it is actually coming up, and we'll just get this back in here, and we're actually going to bring that blood up this way, which is now part of the pulmonary. This is going to be part of the pulmonary trunk. This is actually taking us to part of that pulmonary circulation. And when we take that to the pulmonary circulation, here you can see, and we'll just turn this around, that it is actually divided off into two portions so that it can go to both sides of the lung. Okay, so after it has gone and has now been ventilated, or actually has had oxygen exchanged to it, we're now going to see that that blood is now going to be returned. And that blood is now going to be returned into the left atrium. So just as I have highlighted here, the left atrium, and I guess we should erase all those. There we go. So the left atrium, remember that this area here, these are going to be part of the pulmonary, what are they again? That's right, because they're bringing blood back to the heart, they are now going to be referred to as the pulmonary veins. So these pulmonary veins are bringing blood into that left atrium. Okay, so when they're bringing that blood into the left atrium, we then can see that it is going to, we'll get that out of there, is then going to go into the area that is now going to be referred to as the left ventricle. So when we get into that left ventricle, okay, it is going to take up the largest portion of the heart. It is the biggest part of the heart, and this means that because it is pushing out through to the pulmonary circulation. So what does that mean for us in regards to, where does that blood now go? So let's take a look. That blood is then going to come up through into the aorta, and that blood now is being pushed up through the aorta. Now, a couple places that it is then going to go, and you can see that we do have some vessels that it is immediately going to branch off to, but this is now part of that. This is the aorta, and this is going to be part of that pulmonary circuit, into the systemic circulation. And this is also where a small branch from the aorta is now going to perfuse the myocardium itself. Now, if you want to consider that, although this is the heart, remember that the myocardium is the heart muscle itself. Okay, so it is actually a portion of it. There's going to be 3 layers that we'll find out later on through most courses, that we're talking about the fact that we're dealing with a myocardium at this point. Okay. Now, another way to take a look at this is to also then you could divide. So if we came in here and we divided in the top chambers of the heart, we're going to be referred to, as you can see here, the atrium, and the bottom chambers are going to be referred to as the ventricles. So if you wanted to think from a top to bottom, if you could remember the words atrium and ventricle, this would mean then that you have the ability to go in alphabetical order, and it's A to V. So this way it kind of gives you a little bit better idea as to what's happening. So yeah, if you're looking at this, yes, the screen is moving a little bit and adding some stuff in there. Okay. So I had mentioned just previously about the fact that the heart has its circulation, and it has its own circulation that is actually coming off of the aorta. So right here, you can see that we have some vessels that are truly coming right off of that aorta. So we'll just give you a quick issue here, or a quick little thing, that here is one that is called the left main coronary, and this one here is referred to the right coronary. Okay, so both of these are coming off, and then these are all related to the way that the heart is going to be perfused. And hopefully you remember what the word perfusion is all about. So the heart itself has to have perfusion. So it is a muscle and a muscular organ, therefore it must have some type of circulation. The issue that we'll find out with, and particularly in a lot of things in EMS, is that what happens if there is something that is actually kind of blocking one of these off. So here you can see I just drew a little bit of a blockage that may be occurring in the left anterior descending, and this is actually meaning that there is some type of blockage here. So it will mean that there is potentially very low flow into this area. So anything that's going to be distal to it makes a little bit more sense now, to hopefully you understand that with cholesterol and some of the other factors that we hear about in today's media, that this can potentially cause a big problem for us. And this is dealing now with anything distally. Remember, the word distally means below, or at least below that area that we're talking about, and is now related to the fact this is the left ventricle that is going to essentially be affected. So earlier we had just a little discussion about blood flow through the heart again, and we'll just hopefully try to reiterate this a little bit. So remember that we have blood that, as you can see in this area, that is now going to, actually let me make sure that we can highlight this. Okay, so we now have blood that is coming from, here's the inferior vena cava, here is the superior vena cava. It is now coming into the right atrium. It then pushes to the right ventricle, and then it comes out through into the pulmonary circulation. So this is actually going out into the pulmonary artery. It then, as you can see here, it's branching off so that it affects both lungs, and now it is then oxygenated. And once it is oxygenated, you can see that the blood flow is coming back this way. It's also coming from, remember that this would be the patient's right side, so it is also coming from the right and the left lung, and it is discharging its blood, or taking its blood, to the left atrium, which then pushes it into the left ventricle, and then eventually it comes back out, and you can see that it is now coming out through the aorta. So this is pretty much the way that our heart is expected to flow. And a couple of the things that you may see in here, you see some of these dotted lines where it turns into a yellow area. We'll talk about those in a little bit, but this is the electrical conduction system of the heart, and we'll see that here in a little bit more detail. Now, before we get into talking more and more about what is going to happen with that electrical conduction system, okay? So we'll come to address that hopefully a little bit later on. But some words and some terminology that we need to make sure that we recall. And we can go back and I like to relate, so if I can relate to something that I learned earlier, and this would be one of those areas that I can take a look at. And that would be that if you go back to the respiratory system, we talked about tidal volume, and we talked about respiratory rate and how that affected and became minute volume. We're going to do something very similar to that, but now we're going to change that, and we're going to make these words just a little bit different. So this one over here is going to be stroke volume. So stroke volume is the amount of blood that is actually being discharged from the heart in one beat. So how much blood is being pushed out of the heart in one beat? The HR, or the heart rate, is actually related to what is the rate of speed that the heart is beating. Now, normal heart is going to have a pulse rate or a heart rate of going to be between 60 and 100. That is considered to be normal. Now, if you recall, hopefully with some terminology, anything that is greater than that 100 for the heart is considered tachycardia. Anything that is below 60 is then going to be considered bradycardia. When you calculate those two things out, it refers to how much cardiac output. And that cardiac output is the amount of blood that is actually moved in 1 minute. So when we get into some further discussion in relationship to cardiac arrest, cardiac-related issues, pulmonary system issues, we start talking about shock, we're going to be referring back to this type of diagram, and we're going to say, you know, it's not that you have to know the exact numbers. It's just that you make a recognition. You're able to identify what is happening, what is stroke volume. I know how much blood is being pushed out in one beat. I take that times their heart rate, and I get great cardiac output, or I hope that I have great cardiac output. We'll find out about issues and the way that the body can compensate for some of those issues, and then where we come in as those medical professionals to come in and hopefully help the patient out. What things can we actually do to improve their condition? Now, I made mention about the electrical conduction system. And we had the electrical conduction system, demonstrated just a little bit ago. And we're going to hopefully explain this a little bit more to you. And we'll draw some diagrams here for you. So first off, if you recall that blood is entering into the right atrium, right inside of our right atrium is going to be an area known as the sinoatrial node. And oftentimes we refer to that as the SA node. This is really what starts pushing things off. This is going to be, that SA node is going to fire things at a consistent rate of about 60 to 100 times a minute. And that is what is considered to be normal. You can see that when this actually occurs, that it's also sending electrical impulses over through some different, think of them as wires, and we're sending it over into the left atrium, because remember, the atria and the ventricles are going to contract, so the top and the bottom are going to contract at the same time. It's the way that the heart is going to be. Once it comes down through these internodal pathways, and they almost kind of look something like this, and they come into an area that is now known as the AV node. And this is probably not a big shock that they would call it the AV node, because here is the atria, and then here is the ventricle. So when we talk about the fact that it is sitting in between both of these, that it is now the AV node. After it pauses, it holds that impulse up, and it holds it up for a brief period of time. And after it holds it up for a brief period of time, thinking of, you're kind of going through a toll road. You have a brief period in which you're going to have to slow down. Whether or not you have one of those electronic systems that's going to identify that that you're paying, or you have to stop at the toll booth. Whatever it may be, it then sends that impulse, and it comes down on both the right and the left, and it branches out. And these are going to be known as the Purkinje fibers. And these Purkinje fibers are now going to activate the ventricles. And this is how the electrical conduction system is working in the heart. So it does have its own electrical system. So it's kind of like on its own. And there's a lot of different areas that can control this, including the fact that we could be dealing with some things with the brainstem. We could be dealing with some the issues with the heart itself, so it can identify whether or not it needs to speed up or slow down. Now, we would be remiss if we did not come back and talk about a solid organ that we can find underneath the rib cage that's going to be located in the left upper abdomen. So now left upper quadrant, and we'll break those things down again a little bit later on. But we'll take a look at the left upper quadrant, and what we have is the spleen. Now, the spleen is a filter, and a filter that actually helps to filter some worn out blood cells. We may have some bacteria that is in the blood and any type of other foreign substances. Now, because this is a filter, this also and is a solid organ, it is very susceptible to some type of trauma. And as a result of that, that filter actually is going to be very vascular and is going to contain a lot of blood. So if it is involved in some type of blunt trauma, it can and will potentially have the ability to rupture. So that creates a big problem for us, and this is why when we get into areas such as patient assessment and physical exams and accounting for mechanisms of injury and accounting for some disease processes that may affect the spleen really help us out when we start assessing our patients a little bit more. So now we just talked about blood, and we talked about the fact that blood is going through your veins and your arteries. So we need to think of that as being the hoses that are connecting to the pump, right? So the heart is the pump, the hoses are going to be the veins and the arteries, or that circulatory system. Now, your blood is made up primarily of plasma, which contains water and some proteins and other nutrients and hormones, including oxygen and carbon dioxide and nitrogen, as well as other types of cellular waste. Now, the red blood cells, and you can see here that the plasma takes up a good portion. I mean, it is a very large portion of the blood. It is the liquid portion. The next area that we're going to be dealing with is going to be the blood cells. So we have a couple things that are in here, and this includes that we have the red blood cells, which are going to be right in here. As you can see that these areas here are all going to be considered part of that red blood cell. And again, the red blood cell is where hemoglobin is, and this is what is allowing oxygen to bind to the hemoglobin and be transported through the rest of the body for diffusion. And now this allows for respiration at the cellular level as well. The area that we just kind of skipped over just a hair is going to be this little white buffy area right in this area. And that is because this is what houses the white blood cells. And the white blood cells are going to be related to fighting off infection, and they deal with everything that is inside the immune system itself. So it is actually providing that defense for the body. The last one I talked about in here is the platelets. And the platelets are really there to help form a blood clot. And as we'll find out later on, that in any normal condition, we would love to have platelets be able to come and fight off some issues. However, if there's a problem, maybe in a small vessel, such as a coronary artery, we may find out that the platelets are now going to go in and try to heal a portion of the coronary artery that may have had a plaque break off or a plaque that is ruptured, because it's sensing it as a problem that is occurring inside that vessel. So therefore the platelets start to fix it, and this now forms a blood clot. So that could become a problem later on. You can see in the other two tubes that are located here that, when we talk about anemia, and you'll hear people say, "Oh, it's a lack of blood." It is related to a lack of red blood cells in essence. So their hematocrit is what we're talking about when you hear people talk about that in the hospital. The hematocrit is going to be related to the red blood cells. And here you can see polycythemia, and this is meaning poly, meaning many, and it is related to the blood. So they have an elevated hematocrit, and this means that there is more red blood cells than what we would see. And in some cases, we'll find out that maybe this is a reason why they may have some reddened skin from for some disease processes. I don't know. Can you possibly think of any there? Yeah, we'll come back and take a look at that a little bit later on. All right, so to kind of transition here just a little bit from the anatomy, we talked a lot about how blood flows through the heart and then it has to come out. One of the areas that we have to take a look at, and actually I think I'm on the wrong slide, there we go. So we want to talk about how the blood is actually pushed out, and it's done by pressure. So we are dealing with a high and a low pressure system that occurs in the heart, and this is part of that whole circulatory system physiology. So blood pressure is the pressure that blood exerts against the walls of the artery. So just as you see here, you have a portion of the artery that, oops, I'm sorry. So let me go back there. So we have this portion of the artery, and we're talking about the way that the pressures are going to occur. You can see here that normally, you have these vessels that are just going to provide a little bit of what we're going to refer to as peripheral resistance. And that peripheral resistance is the ability of that vessel to actually constrict or dilate. So if we say we have increasing peripheral resistance, that means that they're constricting. And if we talk about the decrease in peripheral constriction, it means that they're now dilating even more. So, and when we get into some other issues a little bit later on, this is where we start talking about, what happens with hypertension when they have a high blood pressure and stuff like that. What can we take a look at? Systole is what we're talking about when the left ventricle of the heart contracts. It pumps blood from the ventricles into the aorta. And the diastole is when the muscle of that ventricle relaxes and the ventricles now fill with blood. So that's how much pressure is relating or is actually staying inside of that ventricle whenever there is pressure. So we're trying to make sure that it is moving from higher and lower pressures and that things are working well. So we measure this stuff. We measure that forceful ejection of blood from that left ventricle. And we measure that through pulsatile waves whenever we listen to a blood pressure. So when we listen to that blood pressure, we're measuring that with a sphygmomanometer, or we're measuring it with otherwise known as a blood pressure cuff. And that means that we're measuring the high point, or where that wave of the heart is actually contracting. So that's going to be part of the systolic blood pressure when we're actually ejecting the blood out of the heart. And that diastolic is now going to be related to the low point, and that is when everything is relaxing. Now, normally these things are being controlled by at least 3 factors. Now, I'm only showing you essentially one that is here, but, hopefully we take a look at it. And the first one is that we're talking about cardiac output. Cardiac output is going to be one factor that we have to account for. How much blood is actually being pushed out. The other one is now going to deal with 2 other areas that are going to be totally related to peripheral resistance. Again, this is the constriction and dilation of those vessels. And here we talk about the diameter of those arteries. Are they smaller or are they bigger? What has the body been able to do? And then we also want to talk about the quantity of blood that is actually being pushed out. So while, we talk about the amount of blood, we also have to then come back in and talk about how much blood is being pushed out in each beat. So while we talked about cardiac output just a second ago, more than a second ago, but we talk about the fact that we're also dealing with stroke volume, how much blood is actually being pushed out. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on when we get into more specific conditions, but just to keep in mind that those are dealing with peripheral resistance. Now, if people have inadequate circulation, this could mean that, the system has the ability to adjust for it. This means that the vessels start to constrict down and we make it a little bit higher of a pressure system. And I think that one person in doing research for a lot of this stuff, you take a look at some videos, which I found one that was spectacular. But one of the things that he had brought up is that, the whole issue of the heart is to make sure that it maintains pressure. It is the greatest thing in the world. And I'm like, duh, yeah, no kidding. So it was just a blinding flash of the obvious that it is. It's one of the biggest factors that the heart can do is to maintain pressure. So if there's inadequate circulation, the heart is now going to contract more. It's going to increase its rate, and the system is going to have the blood in the arteries. Those systems are going to have to constrict down. And when they constrict down, it's actually trying to increase the pressures that are occurring inside that body. This allows us to, help fix or help the body go through areas in which we may have adjustments that need to occur as a result of patients going into shock where they have poor perfusion. And we'll find out that, when we talk about things such as a perfusion triangle, which requires a good heart, requires good circulation, and requires good fluid that is inside those vessels. We'll talk about how one of those or all of those could affect what's happening. The other thing is that The function of the blood, remember, is it is part of perfusion. It's transporting oxygen, getting rid of some carbon dioxide, and we're getting some other wastes out of there. And of course, we're also transporting nutrients. And as we talked about some blood loss, this may also be one of the factors that we now have to deal with in the way that the blood is going to clot. Okay? So, with that, that's about all I have for this portion of Tim's Takeaway on the circulatory system. We'll see you on the next one, which should be the nervous system. See you soon.